The chilling discovery along the riverside. It was an early, frosty December morning in the tranquil countryside of Montana, where the whispers of the Yellowstone River carved their way through the quiet land. The world seemed hushed, wrapped in a silvery blanket of fog, as a lone fisherman, Joe Henson, trudged through the brittle frost covering the old dirt trail that led to his favorite fishing spot. Joe, a rugged man in his late 50s, had lived in the nearby town of Pine Hollow all his life. Fishing was not only a ritual for his mornings but also an escape from the mundane life of the slow-paced town. That morning didn't seem unlike any other, yet an uneasy chill ran down his spine, his instincts prickling like static in the air. The restless barking of a stray dog, carried through the faint fog, seemed to cut sharper than usual. As Joe descended closer to the riverbank, the oddities began to stack in his mind. The dog, a scrappy, wiry mutt with matted fur, circled frantically near a cluster of reeds, its whine a piercing note that shattered the sleepy atmosphere of the dawn. "What's got you so riled up, buddy?" Joe murmured aloud, more to calm himself than anything else. But as he moved nearer, the pungent smell of decay curled into his nostrils. His boots crunched against something brittle hidden beneath the layers of debris. Swallowing hard, Joe put down his tackle box and advanced with careful steps toward the haunting shape entangled in the reeds. At first he reasoned it might be a deer carcass or some other unfortunate animal, but his knees nearly gave way when the truth hit him like a freight train. There, submerged partially in the icy waters and tangled up with moss-covered roots, was a human foot. Pale and lifeless, it jutted out unnaturally from the reeds, the skin flushed with the ghostly hue of the freezing current. His eyes darted to other fragments littered near the mud-coated edges, dark streaks of what could only be blood mixed with the silt, forming grotesque patterns against the gray rocks. Joe stumbled backward, his breath hitching, heart pounding as though it wanted to escape his chest. "Jesus Christ," he muttered under his breath, his vocal cords straining under the pressure of what he was witnessing. The coffee he'd gulped just an hour before now churned painfully in his stomach. Reaching for the old CB radio strapped inside his coat pocket with trembling hands, Joe fumbled to call for help. His voice quivered as he reported, "Sheriff, it's Joe down by mile marker 6 near the old bridge. It's a body. There's pieces of a body. God almighty." By the time Sheriff Hank Willis and his deputies arrived, the once undisturbed tranquility of Pine Hollow's serene morning had descended into chaos. Hank, a weathered man with deep-set eyes and years of experience etched into the lines of his face, took one look at Joe and knew this was not going to be an ordinary day. His hand instinctively went to rest on his holster, not out of readiness but as a way to steady himself against the impending storm this discovery would bring. The scene spoke volumes before any investigation began. The broken, jagged reeds along the bank, muddy drag marks leading from the embankment to the shallow waters. It was a canvas of violence and despair painted by someone who had operated without mercy. Hank's stomach churned, but the burning in his gut wasn't from fear, it was anger. This was no accidental drowning or nature's savage claim, this was deliberate. As the patrol car's lights flickered against the morning fog and word of the discovery reached the ears of Pine Hollow's tight-knit community, the residents began to gather in somber clusters. Curious whispers and hushed prayers flitted through the crowd like the fragile, shifting mist. Some still clung to disbelief, their minds unable to process that a nightmare had unfolded in the peaceful safety of their hometown. A disturbing scene at the riverbank. Sheriff Hank Willis stood still for a moment when he arrived at the scene. The bitter cold of the Montana morning froze his breath into visible clouds, but what he felt inside was an uneasy heat rising in his chest. He'd seen his share of grim discoveries in over 20 years of service, but something about this one made his intuition hum like a taut wire ready to snap. The muddy riverbank was a mess of unusual signs. The reeds, normally swaying gently in the breeze, were split and broken, as if a struggle had taken place there. Across the loose, wet earth were long, haphazard drag marks leading from the embankment down into the freezing water. Hank crouched to get a closer look, his boots sinking into the mud as he used a gloved hand to wipe at what seemed to be a dark reddish smear on the ground. Blood. He straightened up, swallowing down the bile that flared in the back of his throat, and used his flashlight to trace the outline of the scene. Pieces of twisted reeds stuck out of the ground at tangled angles, mingled with debris washed up from the river. But it wasn't until he spotted something glint in the wet dirt, a small object partially buried, that his gut tightened like a vice. "Hold up! Don't anyone move over here!" Hank said sharply to his deputies, his voice breaking the tense silence. He knelt and carefully pulled out the object with his fingers. It was a metal charm, the kind typically found on bracelets or necklaces. A closer inspection revealed it was shaped like a small heart, its surface etched with delicate designs now dulled by rust and grime. "Bag this," he said without looking up, handing it off to a deputy who approached gingerly with an evidence bag. The sheriff's mind raced. Whatever had happened here didn't feel random. A pattern emerged the more he scanned the surroundings. Every sign pointed to this being a calculated ordeal. The blood smears weren't just accidental splatters, they almost had a deliberate quality, streaked like someone had tried to clean or cover something up but left part of it behind. The drag marks? Wide enough to suggest not just one body part but the weight of a whole body being hauled through thick mud toward the water's edge. Around that time, the forensic team he had called earlier came trundling onto the scene. A medic looked dubious even from a distance as she unpacked her supplies, visibly uneasy with the coldness of the morning combined with the darkness of the task ahead. A crime scene photographer began snapping pictures quietly, his camera's faint clicking the only sound beside the low murmur of the nearby river. "It's deliberate," Hank finally murmured, more to himself than anyone else, removing his hat and pressing a hand to the edge of his brow. He needed to steady himself. He couldn't let his deputies catch even a whiff of the knot of dread building inside him. They depended on his ability to stay calm, especially in situations that tested composure. "Sheriff?" His deputy Carl approached hesitantly, his breath hitching in panic. "You might want to see this." Hank followed Carl a few steps closer to the waterline, where the reeds and debris grew denser. What Carl uncovered in slow, deliberate movements was the stuff that fuzzed Hank's vision momentarily, his fight-or-flight instincts roaring to life. A bundle, coarse cloth filled with something heavy and tangled, was half submerged past the shoreline. As they lifted it out onto slightly firmer ground, an unmistakable, horrifying sight came into full, agonizing view: human remains. "God damn it," Hank muttered under his breath, fighting the urge to punch the air in frustration and grief. "Okay, no one else touches this, you hear me? Everyone step back." The forensics expert, Carla Greason, came quickly to inspect it, reluctant but resolute. Hank watched her lips thin as she knelt to assess whatever she could safely. Without lifting her face toward anyone, she said quietly, "This is fresh. Probably not more than a couple of days. Sheriff, this is looking worse than we might have thought." "Worse how?" Hank asked sharply. She tilted her head back toward the tracks, blood sprays, and now this latest discovery. "This scene, it's too calculated. The way the drag marks line up, the depth of those reeds being crushed, and the precision." She pointed to the edges of some cuts visible on the exposed parts of the body. The blade they used wasn't blunt. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Hank gritted his teeth. That only meant one thing. This was no crime of passion in the heat of the moment. This was premeditated, controlled, animalistic but eerily organized. As Carla worked, Hank took a few measured steps back, away from the scene, letting his cold breath exhale slowly as he turned toward Joe Henson, the poor fisherman who had stumbled upon what might have been the darkest turn his peaceful river had ever seen. The man sat on a rock with a blanket draped over his shoulders, visibly shaking, though whether from the cold or shock was hard to say. Beside him, the wiry stray dog that had circled the scene earlier sat quietly, its head resting on its muddy paws, as if it too understood the gravity of the situation. Hank approached him with soft steps, nodding to the deputy beside him to let them be alone for a moment. Rubbing his gloved hands together, Hank crouched down to Joe's eye level. "Joe, I know this is hard, and you've seen more than anyone should ever see, but anything you can remember, anything at all about what you saw before we got here could help." Joe looked at Hank, his eyes glassy. He mumbled something low and hesitant. "When I first saw it, I thought it was just rubbish washed up from the storm last week. Happens sometimes, but that smell—" He paused, shaking his head as if the memory was too haunting to put into words. "That smell wasn't natural. Then I saw that dog circling and—" Joe began to choke, swallowing hard over his own nerves. Hank placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Take your time." "It's like they knew someone was gonna find it," Joe whispered finally, gripping the blanket tighter. There was an almost paranoid glint in his eyes now. "It wasn't just carelessness, it's like they knew we'd be here finding this today." Identifying the killer. Through elusive clues, the investigation into the horrifying scene by the riverbank began almost immediately, but Sheriff Hank Willis and his team quickly realized they were up against a painfully meticulous and calculating adversary. The clues left behind seemed almost orchestrated, like ghostly breadcrumbs leading toward a shadow that refused to take shape. As the waterlogged remains were transported to the county coroner for examination, Deputy Carl Jenkins worked tirelessly to catalog every item found at the scene. The metal heart-shaped charm, for instance, became an immediate focal point. It was small, unassuming, something that might have fallen off a bracelet or necklace. Yet its presence at the site suggested a personal connection. Hank sat at his desk late that evening, turning the charm over in his hands and narrowing his eyes at the delicate patterns etched into the metal. "If we're lucky, this might get us closer," he murmured to himself, though the weary sigh escaping his lips betrayed the skepticism in his own words. Back at the scene, a forensic team sifted through the mud and reeds, carefully documenting every detail while trying not to disturb potential evidence embedded in the river's edge. They discovered strands of hair tangled in the roots along the embankment, short and dark, not belonging to the fisherman, Joe Henson, who witnessed the scene. "It's human!" Carla Greason, the forensic expert, called out, holding up a sealed evidence bag containing the hair strands. She appeared to grow grimmer the deeper she delved into the site. Alongside the physical evidence, drag marks in the mud told an evocative story. The distinct grooves suggested forceful movement, something heavy being pulled from one point to another with deliberate purpose. The marks curved slightly before disappearing into the icy waters, leaving Hank with the unnerving realization that this killer had not only planned the disposal, but had intentionally chosen this remote riverbank, likely at a time when they were least likely to be stumbled upon. "Whoever this bastard is," Hank muttered under his breath, "they've done this before, or had plenty of time to think about it." The first significant breakthrough occurred when Carla called Hank over to examine fresh mud scraped from one of the victim's remains. Embedded within it were faint traces of industrial lubricant, something Hank immediately flagged as unusual. "That's not river mud," Carla concluded, sharing Hank's curiosity. "It's mixed with oil, possible engine grease or factory runoff. This body didn't end up here by accident." With the evidence carefully packed away, the sheriff gathered his deputies early the next morning for a strategy meeting back at the station. The air carried an unmistakable heaviness as he addressed his team. Maps of the surrounding area were pinned to the wall behind him, bearing bright markers to indicate potential key locations. Polaroid photos of the crime scene bordered the maps, casting an eerie shadow of the grim morning they had stumbled into by the river. "We need to start putting together the pieces. Double time now," Hank said, his voice firm but slightly hoarse. "Whoever did this didn't just stumble into our county by mistake. Start questioning anyone who noticed strange vehicles, suspicious movement, or hell, even unusual interactions in the last few weeks. I don't care how small or stupid the tip might sound." Deputy Carl, twirling the pen in his fingers anxiously, chimed in, "The hair sample. We could try running it through state registries, cross-match it with missing persons reports. If we get lucky, it might lead us to the victim's identity, and from there, someone might have known her enough to point us to a suspect." Another deputy, Sandy Porter, brought up the charm. "Sheriff, what about that piece of jewelry we found? Shouldn't we check local jewelers or pawn shops? It's one of a kind. I'd bet it either gets sold around here or someone in town might recognize it." Hank nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on the charm sitting in the evidence bag on his desk. "Let's track it down," he replied. "Call every damn pawn shop, jewelry store, and antique dealer in the Tri-County area if you have to. Somebody has to know something." As they canvassed the town and surrounding areas, intriguing tidbits began to surface. A waitress at the local diner claimed she had noticed a black pickup truck parked near the old bridge in the middle of the night about a week earlier, its headlights turned off but the faint hum of its engine audible. "It just sat there like whoever was in it was waiting for something," she told Deputy Sandy. "Give you chills thinking about it now." Another lead came from a retired mechanic at the corner gas station who recalled a stranger stopping by late one night, asking for directions to an out-of-the-way trail used mostly by hunters and hikers. "The guy gave me the creeps," the old man recounted to Carl. "Kept his face turned toward the ground the whole time. He was driving an old beater van battered up like it had been dragged through the woods, asked me how far it'd take to reach the Yellowstone." Yet even as these pieces emerged, none gave the sheriff a clear sense of the killer's identity, but they did piece together the vague shadow of a personality. This wasn't someone who acted impulsively. Whoever had left that body at the Yellowstone knew the terrain, planned every step deliberately, and did everything in their power to erase their tracks. To complicate matters, A missing persons report from a neighboring Colorado county caught the team's attention. A young woman named Laura Jensen, last seen 3 weeks ago, leaving work late at a warehouse near Denver. She matched every detail identified from the forensic examination: her height, approximate age, and even her habit of wearing jewelry that matched the gold charm at the scene. But as Hank flipped through the file, he froze at one line in particular. Employed at Crestline Automotive Plant. Crestline, an industrial facility. The grease and oil found in the mud-clad remains suddenly made horrifying sense. Hank removed his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. It's the damn plant. The killer either works there or lured Laura from there. We need to pinpoint anyone associated with Crestline showing erratic behavior. As the team unraveled Laura Jensen's connections and scoured Crestline's employee records, the pieces began to fit together, not perfectly, but just enough. The killer had been methodical and elusive, but Hank knew even the smartest predators left behind traces. And if there was one thing he learned in 20 years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer, it was this. Sooner or later, a hunter trips on his own trail. The shadow of the killer and initial suspicions. The investigation was heating up, and if there was one thing Sheriff Hank Willis knew for sure, it was that the killer had planned every detail meticulously. This wasn't the work of a novice. This was someone who'd dabbled in darkness before. The clues were slippery, scattered deliberately to confuse, but as the puzzle pieces accumulated, the shape of a shadowy figure, a predator hidden among the everyday folk of Pine Hollow, began to emerge. It started with the new lead tied to Crestline Automotive Plant, where Laura Jensen had worked before her disappearance. The sharp crease across Hank's brow deepened as he scoured the employee roster. Hundreds of names. Some sounded familiar because they were locals, but others were drifters, the kind of men and women who take up short-term gigs, stay long enough to earn a paycheck, and then vanish like ghosts. "This isn't going to be easy," muttered Carl Jenkins, the young deputy who had taken it upon himself to comb through the roster with Hank. "I mean, half the people here could have skipped town by now." "Focus on the ones with records," Hank replied, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "Anyone with assault charges, theft, domestic disturbances, hell, even arrests for drunk driving. We're looking for someone who doesn't blend in as well as they think they do." Carl frowned, flipping through the list on the computer. "What are the odds this guy is someone nobody would suspect? You know, like the kind of guy who waves at all his neighbors and pays his taxes on time?" Hank let out a slow exhale, his lips tightening. "Well, if we suspect nobody, that makes everybody suspicious. He's either hiding in plain sight or he knows how to stay invisible. Either way, we're finding him." Over at the local police station, testimonials from townsfolk piled up like fallen leaves. Each was scrutinized carefully. Some were helpful, others were dead ends. A farmer named Wally claimed he'd seen a man standing still for too long near the tree line of the old hiking trails 2 weeks ago. A bartender mentioned that a rough-looking fella had come by last month with greasy hair and a cold, detached demeanor, paying in crumpled bills before disappearing just as quickly as he'd shown up. Neither lead was solid, but Hank filed them away regardless. Then there was the waitress from the diner who brought up the black pickup truck. "Think about it," Hank said during a late-night meeting with his deputies. "A guy sitting in a truck, headlights off, doesn't make sense unless he's either surveilling the area or lying in wait. If that truck's tied to him, it might be the strongest lead we've got." Deputy Sandy Porter chimed in. "I spoke to a couple of guys at the farm supply store. They said a truck like that was parked over by the grain silos a few nights before that body was found in the river, but one of them mentioned it didn't look local. It had plates from Idaho." "Idaho," mused Hank. "That's a ways away. What the hell is someone from that far out doing in a town like Pine Hollow?" "Exactly," Sandy replied. "What if this guy is passing through just like the others have been saying?" "And what if he isn't?" Hank shot back. "What if he's been here all along? A pickup with Idaho plates might just mean he knows someone a state over, or he's clever enough to swap plates to mislead us." Later that week, rumors began swirling faster than Hank and his deputies could chase them. The town, though close-knit and generally calm, was beginning to unravel. People suspected their neighbors. Paranoia clung to the air like fog. The local hardware store owner practically shouted at Hank when he came by to ask questions about potential customers who might have purchased heavy-duty blades. "You're wasting time," the owner snapped. "This ain't about some outsider. You should focus on the weird loners around here. You know, like that guy working over at the scrapyard." That tipped Hank off to a new avenue, the scrapyard. It wasn't exactly the kind of place folks flocked to, and the workers there weren't usually a talkative bunch. True enough, when Hank asked around, a name popped up that raised a red flag: Jeremiah J. Harker. He wasn't from Pine Hollow. He'd moved into town about 6 months ago on what he'd described as a fresh start. Jay's background was patchy at best. He had no fixed address for 3 years prior, spent some time working mid-shift janitorial gigs in Wyoming, and had a minor trespassing charge from back in Spokane. When Hank dug further, he found that Jay had also had close ties to an ex-girlfriend who'd mysteriously dropped off the map 2 years ago. The case had gone cold, but Hank couldn't shake the feeling that Jay might be worth pressing. "What makes you think it's him?" Carl asked when Hank finally stormed out of his office one rainy evening. "It's not a gut feeling," Hank replied while throwing on his hat. "It's the fact that he's sitting on a story with more holes in it than Swiss cheese. I don't trust people who can't account for where they've been, especially not the ones who pop up here like drifters and conveniently disappear after the damage is done." So Hank and Carl paid a visit to Jay at the scrapyard. The man was wiry with sunken eyes and a smile that felt forced, like he was mimicking what normal humans were supposed to do. Jay didn't blink twice when Hank asked about the missing woman's case back in Spokane, defending himself casually. "That was a lifetime ago, Sheriff. You can ask anyone. I didn't have nothing to do with that." "Yeah?" Hank leaned closer, his voice sharp. "Well, I have a body found in my river, Jay. I'm guessing that wasn't you either?" Jay raised his hands defensively, his smirk cracking slightly. "Hey, I don't even go near the river, okay? You won't find my boots anywhere near there." For now, Hank knew he didn't have enough to haul him in, but he kept Jay on his radar. And for good reason. Subtle inconsistencies in Jay's alibi, combined with the strange lack of personal connections he had in Pine Hollow, painted a troubling picture. Still, Hank wasn't ready to make the mistake of narrowing his focus too soon. He called in Carla from forensics again. They combed back over the evidence at the riverbank, testing every fingerprint, fiber and stray piece of debris they could recover. Trackers from the state police searched the nearby woods, hoping to unearth any discarded tools or clothing. If Jay wasn't their man, then who was? The real problem, Hank realized, wasn't just identifying the killer, but proving it beyond a reasonable doubt. Whoever this was, knew how to cover their tracks well. Too well. And something told Hank that if the killer was watching, he might be preparing for his next move. The dark past of the suspect. When Hank Willis and his team dug deeper into the background of Jeremiah J. Harker, the man who had steadily climbed to the top of their suspect list, the sheriff's nagging suspicion began to solidify. Jay wasn't just an outsider trying to make a fresh start in Pine Hollow. He was an enigma wrapped in unsettling details, a transient with a trail of burned bridges and ominous loose ends wherever he'd been. Late one night at the station, Hank sat in his office with Deputy Carl Jenkins, both leaning over a growing pile of reports and paper files. Their shared exhaustion was palpable, but their determination outweighed their weariness. The dim desk lamp cast long shadows across the room as Hank flipped through an incident report from Spokane, Jay's last known residence before he arrived in Pine Hollow. "Look at this," Carl said, pointing to a highlighted section in the file Hank had handed him earlier. Jay's ex, a woman named Teresa Marsh, filed 3 different restraining orders against him, all within the same year. Hank furrowed his brow, tugging at his chin as he read the lines. 3 restraining orders but no convictions. That's what bothers me. Feels like he's been towing the line just enough to stay out of the system. Carl nodded somberly, skimming further as his pen tapped nervously on the desk. There's more. She filed for the first one after Jay smashed the windows of her car during a fight. The second came after he left threatening voicemail messages. And the third, Jesus, Sheriff. She claimed he broke into her apartment while she was at work, but the police never could pin it on him. Apparently he told her, "No locks are gonna keep me out." This guy's got predator written all over him. Hank exhaled, leaning back in his chair with a grim look. But it's not just about what he did to her. Look at the gaps between his jobs, the times he just seems to disappear completely. 3 months here, 6 months there, no paper trail, no proof of how he was making ends meet. Carl's eyes narrowed on another file. You think he was hunting? Using those periods to plan something or to make sure he could vanish completely when people started asking questions? It wouldn't be the first time I've seen someone like Jay keep themselves off the radar, Hank replied, his voice heavy with experience. Drifters like him, they know when to move and how to avoid drawing attention. He's been practicing this for years. Pushing a new set of files across the desk, Hank tapped the top page. Take a look at this. Teresa, his ex, wasn't the only one to file complaints against him. In Wyoming there was another woman, Samantha Price, an old coworker. She told police Jay would follow her home after work and leave flowers on her doorstep, but no charges ever stuck. Carl grimaced. The flowers make it seem weirdly romantic, but combined with everything else it's frightening. It's an escalation pattern, Hank murmured. He starts small, testing boundaries, seeing how much he can get away with. The smashed car windows, the voicemail threats. It's all about control. And when that control doesn't work, he trailed off, letting the weight of his meaning settle into the room. Carl nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. He moves on to darker territory. The pieces continued to unravel, one thread at a time. Carla, the forensic expert, chimed in after sorting through more evidence. "You need to know something," she said to Hank and Carl during an impromptu meeting the next day. "Remember that grease we found on the victim's remains? It's a match for a particular type of lubricant, industrial grade. And guess who spent 2 years working maintenance shifts in body shops across Montana and Wyoming? Jay." "That lines up," Carl said. "He'd have access to it, he'd know what it is, and he'd know how to cover it up. It's almost as if every job he's taken keeps leading him closer into these situations." But it wasn't just Jay's employment record that painted a chilling picture. Hank tracked down an old coworker who remembered Jay from a janitorial job he held at a Wyoming clinic. "He never said much," the man explained over the phone, his voice uneasy. "But he stared at people, at the nurses, at the patients, real creepy. You'd be clipping your badge to your shirt and you'd look up and there he'd be, just standing there, like he wasn't meant to exist in the same space as the rest of us." "Did anything happen while he was working there?" Hank asked, keeping his voice steady though his stomach churned with anticipation. The former coworker hesitated. "Nothing I can say for sure, but there was one night right before Jay left the clinic. A woman came into the ER, battered, frightened. She left before the staff could finish her paperwork. I always wondered if he'd done something, but no one could ever prove it." This wasn't the first such account. As Hank and Carl patched together Jay's fractured timeline, more unsettling details emerged. A trespassing charge in Spokane where Jay allegedly lurked near a woman's home late at night. An arrest for disorderly conduct in Cheyenne after neighbors reported shouting from a building Jay stayed in temporarily. Even his supposed fresh start in Pine Hollow wasn't turning out to be as fresh as Jay had claimed. Finally, there was Teresa Marsh herself, Jay's ex-girlfriend. She'd moved across state lines, but her address wasn't hard to find. Hank called her under the pretense of asking about someone who used to live in Spokane. At first she was curt, clearly wary of answering questions about Jay. "He's dangerous," she said eventually, her voice shaking. "And he's smart. Whatever you think he's done, it's worse. He'll make you think you're losing your mind if it serves him. He doesn't care." "He's here in Pine Hollow," Hank admitted. "We believe he's tied to a murder." Her sharp intake of breath through the phone made Hank's chest tighten. "I knew it. I always knew he was going to end up killing someone. He used to talk about how women thought they were always in control. He hated it, said they didn't deserve to think they were better than him." The call ended shortly after, but her words lingered in Hank's mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. What frightened him the most wasn't just what Jay had done, it was what he was capable of doing next. The relentless manhunt and a breathless chase. The search for Jeremiah J. Harker had become an all-consuming mission. It was as if the entire state of Montana was holding its breath, waiting for Sheriff Hank Willis and his team to finally bring the elusive suspect to justice. After weeks of piecing together Jay's scattered and sordid past, the team now had enough evidence to firmly identify him as their prime suspect in the grisly murder at Yellowstone River. But their lead crumbled before their eyes when Jay vanished without a trace. It started with his absence from the scrapyard where he worked. A co-worker, dirty-faced and wide-eyed, approached Hank at the station. "We haven't seen Jay in 2 days, the man stammered. "He never picks up a paycheck late, ever." That immediately set off alarms. Hank, seated at his desk going over arrest protocols, bolted upright. "He knows," he muttered. Jay had figured out the walls were closing in, and just like the predator he'd shown himself to be, he'd slipped the net before it could tighten. Teams were dispatched immediately. Deputies were sent to Jay's rented room, only to find it disturbingly empty. He hadn't just skipped town, he'd cleared out like a ghost. His clothes, tools, everything was gone, save for an old coffee-stained newspaper crumpled on the floor. It was clear he'd planned this. "Damn it!" Hank growled as he combed through the room, frustration pooling in his chest. "He's 2 steps ahead." "We've got an APB out on him," Carl said as he jogged up the steps to meet Hank. Every county, every border crossing has his description. If he breathes too hard, someone's gonna hear about it. But Hank wasn't comforted. Jay was clever. Too clever. Years of slipping through the cracks had taught him how to plan and disappear. Hank leaned against the doorway of the empty room, staring vacantly past the deputies rifling for clues. "This guy's already got a head start," he muttered. "He could be halfway across the state by now. Hell, halfway across the country." Still, the sheriff wasn't about to back down. Within hours, he had his deputies scouring every corner of Pine Hollow and setting up roadblocks on every highway funneling out of town. Leads came trickling in, but most turned out to be useless. A woman at a gas station thought she'd seen Jay buying beef jerky and a map 2 towns over. Someone else swore they'd spotted his black pickup at a diner near the Idaho border, but with every reported sighting, Jay seemed to vanish again before they got close. Hank barely slept in the weeks that followed, his coffee habits spiraling into a permanent caffeine-jittered state of hyperfocus. "Remind every trooper that this isn't just a guy on the run," he barked to Carl one morning as they pieced pins on a map of the region. "Jay's dangerous. If we don't get him now, we'll have another body to pull from a river." The case took a critical turn when a deputy flagged a sighting of Jay's pickup truck parked deep in a wooded rest area near the southeastern edge of the state. But by the time Hank's team descended, they found the vehicle stripped of its plates and abandoned beside a barely visible trail into the forest. Inside the cab was nothing but a faded leather jacket draped over the torn seat, soaking in exhaust fumes that hung like a phantom in the air. "He's still close," Hank insisted, shining his flashlight into the dense thicket ahead. The team fanned out with tracker dogs, their barking echoing in the vast forest, but the darkened trail betrayed no clear direction. Jay had vanished yet again, melting into the rugged wilderness like smoke into a windy sky. The bigger problem was the growing tension in Pine Hollow and beyond. Jay's escape began to feel like an open wound, festering with every passing day that the killer remained at large. News outlets seized on the story, calling it the Yellowstone fugitive case. Reporters swarmed the quaint town, their flashing cameras and questions only fueling the growing unease among residents. People began desperately locking their doors at dusk, while local businesses plastered "Wanted Jeremiah Harker" posters in their windows. Despite the public pressure, Hank pressed on, his team following every lead and instinct. One anonymous tip led them to a small, secluded motel off a dusty back road outside St. Paul. The manager, a wiry man with a cigarette perpetually hanging from his mouth, confirmed he'd rented a room to someone matching Jay's description. "He wasn't chatty," the manager said, leaning against the counter with an uninterested shrug. "Paid cash, barely looked me in the face. Checked out early though, real early. Left behind a coffee cup." That coffee cup ended up being the break Hank had been waiting for. Carla, the forensic expert, ran tests and confirmed Jay's prints on the cup's rim. The knowledge that they were finally close enough to sniff the trail brought something at least resembling hope back to Hank's exhausted team. The final act came when another tip came in from a driver on the interstate, reporting a thin man pacing nervously in and out of a service station restroom near Chicago. Hank jumped at the lead, mobilizing nearby officers to converge on the area while roadblocks south of the city were constructed. What followed was pure chaos. Just as officers closed in under the cover of unmarked cars and tireless patience, Jay spotted them. Realizing his cover was officially blown, Jay bolted. He rushed to a battered old sedan parked at the edge of the lot and peeled out onto the highway with screeching tires. A high-speed pursuit ensued, the sounds of blaring sirens cutting through the night as Hank joined over the radio, his voice hoarse. "Do not lose sight of him. I don't care who you call or what roads you block, I want him off the damn highway." The chase stretched for miles, Jay weaving recklessly through traffic at over 90 miles per hour. Patrol cars flanked him, forcing him toward the shoulder as his sedan trembled under the strain of the speed. In one frightening moment, Jay veered off an exit ramp, plowing straight through a wooden barrier and into an open field. Deputies followed, their headlights bouncing wildly over the uneven terrain. Helicopters circled above as the chase unfolded like an action movie come to life. The ending was as dramatic as the build-up. Jay's car finally gave out, the engine sputtering and choking before grinding to a screeching halt. Surrounded, he staggered out of the car, hands shaking but empty. He stared at the squad cars encircling him, their lights spinning wildly, and for the first time in months, Hank exhaled. "Jeremiah Harker," Hank called out, his voice steady and unshaken despite the evening's chaos. "It's over, there's nowhere left to run." Jay smirked, his face pale and dirty, and muttered something unintelligible as deputies rushed him and slapped on the cuffs. For Hank, it wasn't just the end of a chase. It was the beginning of finally bringing justice to the victim who'd lost their life on the icy banks of the Yellowstone. But even as Jay was led away, Hank couldn't let go of the faint feeling of warning echoing in his gut, as if Jay still held cards no one else knew about. And something told him the nightmare wasn't over, not yet. Clues from an abandoned house. The anonymous letter arrived on Hank Willis's desk 5 restless days after Jeremiah J. Harker's dramatic capture and arrest. The faded yellow envelope bore no return address, only the typewritten words, "You need to see for yourself," accompanied by directions to a remote, decrepit house just outside St. Paul. With no signature or indication of who had sent it, Hank immediately suspected one of two things, either a helpful but cautious whistleblower or someone looking to lead the sheriff on a wild goose chase. Either way, he had to follow through. The house itself fit the description of something straight out of a ghost story. Perched on the edge of a forgotten gravel road surrounded by gnarled trees and waist-high weeds, it was almost entirely hidden from view. The windows were boarded up haphazardly with planks weathered gray by time, and the roof sagged as though it had already resigned itself to collapse. Hank and his deputies pulled up at the site one chilly morning with a mix of trepidation and determination. "You sure this isn't just a prank, Sheriff?" Deputy Carl Jenkins asked, shifting nervously while unstrapping his flashlight. "If it's a prank, it's a hell of a specific one," Hank replied grimly, holding up the letter once more. His tone left no room for doubt. "We've got to check it. We can't afford to ignore anything right now, not with everything we've been through." He shot Carl a knowing look, their shared fatigue hanging between them. As they approached the house, the crunch of their boots on gravel and dead leaves heightened the eerie silence around them. The air smelled damp, heavy with mildew. The stray dog that had somehow become an unofficial member of their team, adopted by Joe Henson, the fisherman who had first discovered the body, trotted reluctantly behind them, sniffing and whining as though even it wanted to turn back. They entered cautiously, Hank leading the way with his flashlight slicing through the shadows of the dim interior. The first thing they noticed was the overwhelming smell, a pungent blend of decay, mold, and something metallic. It clawed at their senses and brought a grimace to their faces. "Jesus," muttered Carl, covering his nose with his sleeve. "That smell alone tells me we're going to find something nasty." The living room, if it could even be called that, was in shambles. Old furniture sat like sagging skeletons of their former selves, covered in layers of grime. But despite the obvious decay, there were strange signs of human activity sprinkled through the filth. A scratched table with an assortment of burnt candles, a mattress stained with substances no one wanted to think about. Hank's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of something glinting in the faint beam of his flashlight. "Over here!" Hank gestured, crouching down toward the end of the room. Resting against the rotting wood floor was a knife, its blade coated in flaking dried blood. He reached for his evidence bag and carefully sealed the weapon inside. Near it lay scattered photographs, each one curling at the edges with age and discolored over time. Hank's pulse quickened as he began flipping through the images. "What is it?" Carl asked, stepping closer. "Pictures," Hank said, his voice tightening. Staring back at him from the photos was a series of faces. Young women, their expressions candid, many seemingly unaware they were being photographed. One of the faces was chillingly familiar. It was Laura Jensen, the victim whose dismembered remains had been found in the river. "Oh my God!" Carl muttered, his own face draining of color. "These are his victims, aren't they? How many—" The stack of pictures offered no clues as to when or where these had been taken. However, one thing was clear. This wasn't a new habit for Jay Harker. The obsessive way these images had been cataloged and hidden here suggested it was part of an ongoing compulsion. The discoveries didn't end there. Scrawled across one of the cracking walls in uneven, feverish handwriting was a message that stopped the team cold. Written in what looked like red paint, or perhaps something far more sinister, were the words, "I win when you lose." Hank stared at it for a moment, feeling a bitter chill seep into his bones. Whoever had left this message had not only reveled in their acts, but had a sick understanding of the psychological blow they intended to deliver to those who would pursue them. "Sheriff," called out one of the other deputies from another room, "you're going to want to see this." Hank followed the voice, his boots creaking against the weak floorboards. The deputy had found what looked like a crude shrine in the corner of the kitchen. a series of trinkets arranged with unsettling care, gold charms, lockets, earrings, all nestled together on a ragged piece of black fabric. It was like a trophy display, each item belonging to a life Jay had taken or planned to take. "God help us," Hank whispered under his breath as Carla, their forensic expert, arrived at the scene to catalog everything. "This isn't just a hiding place," Carla said firmly after inspecting the remnants in the house. This is personal. It's a keepsake collection, a place where he could come back to relive everything he's done and prepare for whatever he wanted to do next. Further exploration led them to a rusted metal box buried under layers of debris in a closet. Inside they found a handwritten journal. The pages alternated between erratic scribbles and detailed accounts of Jay's conquests. Each vicious detail painted a terrifying picture of a man fueled by anger and obsession. Disturbingly, the notes also hinted at plans, names of women he had stalked, descriptions of where they worked, what times they left home. Pages were filled with detailed timelines for future attacks. "This son of a bitch was just getting started," Hank said, his voice cracking slightly as he clenched the journal in his hands. He was planning more, far more. But perhaps the most horrifying discovery was a small Polaroid tucked into the back of the journal. It was a picture of Hank's own home, a blurry image taken from a distance at night, showing his wife in the kitchen, oblivious to the creeping danger. Hank's fists tightened around the journal, his jaw clenching so hard he thought his teeth might break. "He was watching me," he whispered, his voice low but trembling with fury. The realization was almost unbearable. The case had gone beyond professional and become chillingly personal. "Carl!" Hank barked sharply, turning to his deputy. "Set up more patrols near my house. I want my family watched 24/7 until we're sure this nightmare is over." That abandoned house didn't just hold the horrors of Harker's mind, it acted as a glaring reminder of how close he had come to staking his claim on more lives, including Hank's own. As the evidence from the house piled up, one thing became clear. This case and Harker's hold on Pine Hollow was far from finished. The perfect trap and the day he was caught after Jeremiah. Jay Harker's unnerving journal surfaced at the decrepit house. Sheriff Hank Willis knew he needed to shift gears. The journal revealed not just Jay's grim past but his calculated plans for more brash and gruesome moves. Jay wasn't done, and that fact weighed on Hank's shoulders heavier than anything he'd faced in his career. Hank wasn't just dealing with catching a murderer, he was playing a high-stakes game of chess against a cold-blooded predator who thrived on control and manipulation. To beat Jay, Hank's team needed to think like him, anticipate his next step, and set the perfect trap. "We're done waiting for this bastard to slip up," Hank said during a meeting with his deputies. His voice had the grit of sleepless nights but carried unshakable determination. "We know how he thinks. He doesn't act on impulse. He's deliberate. He plans every inch of his moves before they happen. So now, it's time we plan just as carefully." Deputies Carl Jenkins and Sandy Porter sat across the table, nodding hesitantly. "What are you thinking, Sheriff?" Carl asked. His pen hovered over the notepad on the table, ready to jot down whatever strategy was coming. "We need to give him what he's looking for," Hank began, tapping his index finger against the file containing Jay's journal. "Every entry in this book points to one thing: he can't resist watching. He could have disappeared already, going on the run like most fugitives, but we've seen it. He's left hints on purpose. Souvenirs, trails. He waits for us to figure it out. He craves it even." "So, you're saying he's still watching, staying close enough to mess with us?" Sandy asked, the disbelief clear on her face. "Exactly," Hank replied firmly. "He's following the case. Hell, he probably already knows we found this damn journal. If we dangle the right bait, he won't be able to resist. He'll come to us." The room was silent for a moment as everyone digested the sheriff's words. "And what kind of bait are we talking about?" Carl finally asked. "A press conference," Hank said, sitting upright, his eyes sharp. "We announce we're intensifying the search, and that we've made a breakthrough. But we hold back enough of the evidence to keep him guessing, make him curious about what we do or don't know. It'll lure him into the open." "That's risky, Sheriff," Sandy said, her brow furrowing. "What if he doesn't take the bait? He could just disappear, go completely dark." "Then we're no worse off than we are now," Hank countered. "But I don't think he'll resist. Jay's ego is too big to let us think we're ahead of him. He'll want to see our next move for himself." 2 days later, the staged press conference was held on the steps of Pine Hollow's courthouse. Camera crews buzzed with anticipation as Hank stood in front of a podium, flanked by Carl and Sandy. Hank addressed the growing media swarm with calculated precision, announcing that new evidence had been uncovered and that they were closing in on their suspect. "We're confident the suspect has ties to the areas surrounding Pine Hollow and eastern Minnesota," Hank said, his words clear and steady enough to give a picture of control but vague enough to leave room for interpretation. "This investigation has been relentless, and we're diligent in following every lead to ensure justice is served." Watching from the fringes of the camera lights, Hank scanned the gathered crowd. He wasn't foolish enough to think Jay would show up in person. He was smarter than that. But he was certain Jay was watching. Somewhere in some dingy motel or dark corner of a basement, the broadcast of this very moment was flickering across an old television screen. Hank's gut told him the trap had been set, and all they needed to do now was wait for Jay to crack. Behind the scenes, they had already picked the spot for the ambush. Sandra Stevens, a police officer working undercover, was introduced into the plan as the bait. She would play the role of a lone waitress leaving a small diner in the middle of nowhere, a perfect target that was bound to tick all the boxes in Jay's twisted mind. They chose an area near the edge of a remote forest, knowing Jay's history of picking isolated spots for his crimes. "This is the spot he'll go for," Carl said, tracing a red line on the map in front of them. "It's isolated, there's a highway for fast getaways, but no traffic cameras nearby. This is where we hit him." "Perfect," Hank agreed, as he finalized the plan. Snipers from the state police were stationed in nearby woods. Officers were disguised as regular customers appearing to move casually in and out of the diner on the scheduled night. All attention was carefully fixed on Sandra as she made her entrance, dressed in simple average clothes that screamed easy target. She rehearsed her part for hours, taking the trash out to the back alley, walking to her car, and making a slow, deliberate retreat into the forest's edge. "What if he doesn't go for her?" Sandy asked quietly as the night closed in and the team moved into position. "Oh, he'll go for her," Hank stated flatly, peering through the dense trees with his binoculars. "This setup is exactly the kind he's been waiting for." As Sandra played her part, walking under dim light into the empty alley behind the diner, the team watched with bated breath. Hours passed in tense silence before the first sign emerged, faint movement in the shadows just beyond the diner parking lot. Hank's heart hammered against his chest. "Hold positions," Hank hissed into his radio. "Don't move until I give the order." Through his binoculars, Hank spotted a figure stepping forward, a wiry silhouette with slow, calculated steps. It wasn't hard to tell, it was Jay. He crept toward Sandra, who was now pretending to fumble for her keys by her car door. The whole team knew the danger as everyone tightened their grips on weapons, but no one moved prematurely. Jay was almost within reach of Sandra when Hank made his move. "Go! Now!" he shouted into his radio. Lights burst from the surrounding woods as officers swarmed the scene in a well-coordinated sweep. Jay froze for a split second before bolting. It wasn't surprising. Hank had predicted this exact reaction. Jay took off toward the woods, thinking the trees would shield him from view, but this wasn't just any chase. This was a hunt. Snipers positioned strategically along the forest's edge reported Jay's movements over radio channels as officers doggedly pursued him through the terrain. Panting, Hank and Carl pushed harder, weaving through trees with their flashlights catching quick glimpses of Jay bounding over roots and branches. Every second felt stretched, muddied by the sounds of breaking twigs and whispered grunts echoing around the group. Finally, Jay broke out onto a dirt road where a blocked-off state highway stood like a trap, waiting to spring. The flashing red-blue pulse of squad car lights enveloped him from all sides. Realizing he was cornered, Jay dropped to his knees, his breathing ragged, his hands trembling as they moved into the air. "It's over, Jay!" Hank growled, stepping forward with his weapon aimed. He didn't need to yell. Jay knew he was done. Jay let out a bitter laugh, that damn smirk reappearing on his dirt-smeared face. "Well, Sheriff," he rasped, his voice raw from the chase, "it was fun while it lasted." Hank didn't flinch. He didn't let his gun lower until Jay was tackled to the ground and the cuffs were securely in place. "Not fun for the people you've hurt," Hank muttered under his breath. As officers hauled him away, Hank looked up toward the sky, exhaling deeply. Relief mixed with the knowledge that his team had just closed one of the darkest chapters in Pine Hollow's history. But even as Jay was loaded into the squad car, Hank knew deep in his gut there'd still be battles ahead. Jay wasn't finished telling his story, and Hank wasn't finished dealing with its fallout. A chilling confession. The interrogation room was a stark, cold contrast to the chaos that had surrounded Jeremiah J. Harker's capture just days earlier. The walls were bare, the fluorescent light hummed faintly, and the sharp scent of disinfectant hung thick in the air. Focused and unrelenting, Sheriff Hank Willis sat across from Jay, the two men separated by a steel table that had seen the worst humanity had to offer. Jay, in his plain orange jumpsuit, sat slouched in his chair, an air of smug calm radiating from him. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this opportunity, a twisted performer ready to finally take center stage. Hank didn't let his guard down for a second. Jay wasn't just cunning. He was manipulative to his core. This wasn't going to be a confession filled with remorse or shame, that much Hank already knew. The room wasn't going to witness tears of regret or pleas for forgiveness. What Hank was bracing for was the sheer, unfiltered cruelty of a man who viewed human lives as pawns in his own sadistic game. "Care for a cup of coffee, Jay?" Hank asked, his tone calm but taut, as he slid a battered metal chair back and sat down. "I figured you might be thirsty after all that running." Jay snorted, the corner of his mouth curling into a sardonic grin. "You offering me coffee now, Sheriff? What's next, donuts?" He leaned back, his handcuffed wrists resting in his lap with a casualness that sent shivers down Hank's spine. "Didn't peg you for the hospitality type." "Figured I'd start this off civil," Hank replied coolly, his hands clasping lightly on the table. "But I guess civility doesn't mean much to a man like you." Jay raised an eyebrow, that smug grin widening. "A man like me?" He tilted his head slightly as if offended but secretly entertained. "You mean smart enough to keep you chasing me halfway across the damn country?" "No, I mean a man twisted enough to think he's the smartest one in the room," Hank said sharply, leaning forward, his tone clipped but controlled. "But here's the thing about being smart, Jay. Real smart men know when the game is up." Jay chuckled darkly, a low, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of Hank's neck stand on end. "Game's only over when I say it's over, Sheriff." His voice dropped, his eyes narrowing. "You've got no idea how deep this goes, do you?" "Oh, I think I've got a pretty decent picture," Hank replied, sliding the evidence folder he'd brought onto the middle of the table. It landed with a flat thud, and for the first time Jay's eyes flicked downward, curiosity unmasked. Hank opened it slowly, pulling out photos of Laura Jensen, her face smiling and full of life, a sharp contrast to the atrocities they'd uncovered on the riverbank. He didn't say anything at first, letting the photo speak for itself as he laid it carefully in front of Jay. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but carried the weight of unshakable resolve. "Tell me about Laura." Jay was silent, his grin faltering ever so slightly. But just as Hank thought he might have struck a nerve, Jay leaned forward, his smile returning like it had never left. "Ah, Laura," he said softly, almost reverently. "She was different, pretty, you know. Real pretty, but she had that look. Like she thought she was better than everyone else. I could see it in her eyes, the way she'd walk around like the world owed her something." Hank clenched his jaw, keeping his anger buried just beneath the surface. He refused to let Jay see how deeply his words cut, how personal this had all become. Jay continued, his voice taking on an unnervingly calm tone, like someone recounting an uneventful afternoon. "She should have been nicer. Shouldn't have looked at me like I was some—" "Nobody. That's the problem with girls like her. They think they're untouchable." "And so you killed her," Hank said bluntly, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Jay's face twisted into an expression that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite pride, a chilling in-between that Hank would never forget. "It wasn't about killing, Sheriff," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He leaned in closer, the chains around his wrists clinking faintly against the table. "It was about teaching her a lesson, teaching them all a lesson." "Who's them, Jay?" Hank asked, his voice steady despite the growing knot of rage building in his chest. "You mean women? People you thought looked down on you?" "People who think they're untouchable," Jay spat, venom lacing his words. "People who act like they're better than me, like I'm invisible. You want the truth, Sheriff? Killing her, it felt like taking back control, like, for once, I was the one calling the shots." The room fell into an eerie silence as those words hung in the air. Hank's hand reflexively clenched into a fist under the table, every fiber of his being wanting to lash out at the monster sitting across from him, but he couldn't, not yet. He had to keep him talking, get him to admit to more. "And Laura wasn't enough for you, was she?" Hank pressed, his voice quieter now but firm. "You plan to do it again? To hurt more women?" Jay sat back, his grin creeping back onto his face like the venomous slide of a snake. "Oh, Sheriff," he said, shaking his head mockingly, "you think Laura was the first or the last? She's just the one you happened to find. There are others, you'll figure that out soon enough." Hank didn't let his reaction show, though his heart pounded harder in his chest. "You're saying there are more victims," he said evenly, his tone betraying none of the anger threatening to spill over. Jay shrugged as if it was the most casual statement in the world. "I never kept count, but yeah, if you start digging, you'll find them. They're out there. I've left pieces of myself everywhere I've been." "Why tell me this?" Hank demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Why now? Is this just a game to you?" "A game?" Jay leaned forward, his grin turning sharp and sinister. "No, Sheriff, it's not a game, it's a legacy. And I'm giving it to you because you'll never stop chasing it. I'll rot in that cell, but I'll live in your head long after I'm gone. Every time you find another one of my girls, you'll remember me. You'll remember that I beat you. That I made you feel it." Hank's throat tightened as he stared at the monster across from him. "You didn't beat anyone, Jay," he said fiercely. "You're behind bars now, and every victim you left behind will get the justice they deserve, starting with Laura Jensen." For the first time, Jay's grin faltered, just slightly, but he quickly covered it, leaning back and smirking once more. "We'll see, Sheriff, we'll see." Hank stood, his hands gripping the steel table so hard his knuckles turned white. "This isn't over, Jay," he said, his voice low but filled with finality. "Mark my words, it's not you I'll remember, it's them. And I'll make sure no one ever forgets what you took from this world." As Hank left the room, he felt the full weight of the confession pressing down on him. Jay Harker wasn't just a killer, he was a cruel, calculating predator who had turned pain into his own twisted currency. But in that moment, standing outside the interrogation room and looking through the glass at Jay's smug, unrepentant face, Hank made a silent vow. He would not let this man's legacy of terror define him or the town of Pine Hollow. Justice would prevail, no matter how deep the darkness went. The trial that fought for justice. The courthouse was swarming with people. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras flashing as they barked questions no one would answer. Townsfolk from Pine Hollow and beyond gathered in the back rows of the courtroom, the weight of the situation pulling them into a collective hush. Jeremiah J. Harker was no longer the name of a man. He was a specter of fear, a ghost of pain, and soon a monster that justice was determined to banish for good. Sheriff Hank Willis stood just outside the courtroom doors, his hands resting on the wooden railing leading up the steps. His thoughts churned like thunderclouds. After months of chasing Jay, piecing together his crimes and wrestling with sleepless nights, Hank couldn't help but feel a haunting sense of finality as he stared at the courthouse. Today was not just about one man's judgment, it was about healing for the families broken by Jay's actions. It was about proving to Pine Hollow, no, to the nation, that monsters like Jay could not win. "Hank, you coming in?" Deputy Carl Jenkins asked, stepping down the stairs toward him. His voice shook a little, though he tried to hide it. Hank gave a small nod, adjusting his belt and hat, as his eyes lingered momentarily on the town square behind them. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped through the courthouse doors. The air inside felt heavier than the brisk fall wind outside. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat in the first couple of benches, clutching tissue boxes, photographs in one another's hands. The Fisher family, relatives of Laura Jensen, the woman whose dismembered body had been found by the Yellowstone River, were front and center. Her parents' faces were solemn masks of grief and determination. Her younger sister clutched a worn scarf Laura had once owned, holding it so tightly that her knuckles turned white. As Hank entered, all eyes briefly turned to him. He nodded to a few familiar faces, the silent message clear: "We're here to finish what we started." And then there was Jay. Sitting at the defense table, he looked almost unremarkable, dressed in a cheap, off-white shirt and slacks provided by the prison system. His smug expression was gone, replaced by something colder: indifference. He scanned the room lazily as if watching a performance he had grown bored of, but Hank caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. Even after all this time, even with overwhelming evidence stacked against him, Jay still believed he held power in that room. Case number 3264, the state of Montana v. Jeremiah Harker. The judge's voice rang clear and commanding as she entered, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a demeanor that said she'd seen everything. "Is the prosecution ready to begin?" The prosecuting attorney, Amanda Caldwell, stood tall and proud. She was in her late 40s, hair tied neatly back, dressed in a dark suit that exuded competence. Hank had worked with her before. She was tough as nails and brilliant in tearing apart cases. This was personal for her, too. "We're ready, Your Honor," Amanda said, her voice steady. She turned slightly to gesture toward the gallery. "What we're about to bring forward today isn't just a case of murder, it's a portrait of calculated evil. Jeremiah Harker is not a man who stumbled into violence. He planned it, he thrived on it, and today we're here to make sure he answers for it." Jay didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like a child waiting impatiently in a dentist's office. But Hank could see the nerves in his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The trial unfolded with the careful precision of a surgeon dissecting a deadly tumor. Amanda brought out piece after piece of evidence, her voice unwavering as she narrated the timeline of Jay's crimes. The jury squirmed as photos were presented, images of Laura Jensen's remains, discovered by the riverside, alongside horrified testimonies from the forensic team. Carla Greason, Hank's forensic expert, took the stand first. She explained in excruciating detail the meticulous nature of Jay's methods, how the drag marks at the riverbank weren't just clumsy attempts at disposal, but deliberate efforts to conceal, to confuse. She described the industrial lubricant found on Laura's remains and tied it back to Jay's work history in various body shops. Every word out of Carla's mouth felt like a hammer driving nails into Jay's coffin. "He knew exactly what he was doing," she said, catching the jurors in her stern gaze. "This was not a crime of opportunity, it was planned." Next came the journal. The court fell silent as Amanda held it up, a worn, leather-bound book that had become almost mythical in the media frenzy surrounding the trial. Page after page of Jay's obsessions played on the overhead screens, his erratic handwriting filling the room with the stench of his madness. "What sticks out most," Amanda said, flipping through the pages before glancing over at Jay, "is the clear, premeditated repetition. Every victim, a timeline. He followed them for weeks, sometimes longer, cataloging their habits. It wasn't enough to hurt them, he wanted to control every aspect of who they were, even in death." The jury shifted in their seats as Amanda's assistant read aloud an excerpt from Jay's writings. "They don't know I'm watching, but they will, they all will. When they see what I can do, they won't ignore me anymore." Hank knew the trial was taking its toll, especially on the families. Reliving the horrors Jay had inflicted, hearing the grotesque details of his crimes, and even seeing his cold, emotionless face, the weight was crushing. But no one dared step out. No one wanted to miss the moment justice would finally land its blow. Jay's defense attorney tried his hardest to poke holes in the prosecution's narrative. He argued that the trail of evidence was circumstantial at best, that there wasn't enough to definitively tie all the victims to Jay. And perhaps most infuriating of all, the defense leaned into Jay's performance of indifference, attempting to convince the jury that he was simply being framed by overzealous investigators. But it wasn't enough. The evidence was airtight. From DNA matches to Jay's handwriting in the journal, from witness testimonies to the stash of grisly Polaroids found in his hideout, there was no escaping the truth. Finally, it was time for the families to speak. Laura's mother approached the stand, clutching her prepared notes but unable to stop the tears from flowing. "My daughter Laura," she began, her voice breaking, "she was kind, so kind. She loved painting, she loved animals, and now, because of this man—" She paused to glare at Jay, her pain radiating through the courtroom. "Because of him, we have a hole in our hearts that will never heal. My baby girl deserved better. She deserved life." When she stepped down, Hank caught her eye and gave her the slightest nod, a signal that he too carried the weight of her loss and wouldn't rest until justice was served. The closing arguments were brief but powerful. Amanda stood before the jury with the calm authority of someone who knew victory was in sight. Jeremiah Harker didn't just kill, he terrorized. He took the lives of innocent women and laughed while doing it. This isn't just a trial about facts, it's a trial about ensuring that no other family suffers what these families have endured. We ask you to deliver justice, for Laura, for every woman who was silenced by this man. The jury deliberated for 3 hours that felt like an eternity. When they returned, the faces of the 12 men and women carried a gravity that silenced the packed courtroom. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jeremiah Harker, guilty on all counts," the foreman announced, his voice steady but soft. Cries of relief and sobs filled the room. Laura's sister wept into her mother's arms while Hank finally allowed himself the smallest exhale. Justice wasn't restorative. It couldn't bring back the lives Jay had taken. But it was something. It was a declaration that for all the darkness Jay tried to spread, there was light determined to extinguish it. When the judge delivered the sentence, death by lethal injection, the courtroom erupted in a mix of solemn nods and quiet tears. As Jay was led away in cuffs, his smirk finally dissolved, replaced by something far less confident. For the first time, Sheriff Hank Willis allowed himself to feel a flicker of triumph. This fight was over, not perfect, not complete, but over nonetheless. And even as Hank knew he'd carry the scars of this case forever, he also knew Pine Hollow and its people could finally begin to heal. Justice had been served. A legacy of pain and the lessons left behind. The J. Harker case may have concluded in the courts, but its shadow lingered over Pine Hollow like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. The town, once an idyllic and tightly knit community, bore the scars of what had transpired. It wasn't just the lives taken by Harker's cruel hands, it was the collective innocence that had been lost. The case didn't simply affect the families of the victims, it rippled outward, touching everyone who had followed the story, everyone who had locked their doors at night, everyone who had looked over their shoulder while walking home. Sheriff Hank Willis couldn't help but carry the weight of it all. After the trial had ended, with Jeremiah J. Harker sentenced to death, Hank stood beneath the sprawling oak in his backyard, staring out at the oranges and pinks of the sunset. A beer sat untouched on the rail of the porch. The quiet should have comforted him, but it didn't. It only reminded him of how loud the world had been during the months-long manhunt for Harker, how fear had silenced simple joys and left people feeling more vulnerable than they'd ever been. Carl Jenkins, Hank's loyal deputy, found him there one evening, sitting with the same distracted air that had consumed him since the trial. Carl held a file folder in one hand and a six-pack in the other. "You gonna sit out here every night until the world makes sense again?" Carl asked jokingly, setting the beer down on the porch railing. Hank gave a slow smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was better than nothing, Carl thought. "Trying to figure out what comes next," Hank replied honestly. He gestured toward the town in the distance. "Seems like everyone out there is still holding their breath. They're trying to go back to normal, but it's like the air's different now. You feel it?" Carl gave a nod and sat down beside him. "Yeah. People don't just lose a neighbor or a friend when something like this happens, they lose the idea that they're safe." He popped the cap off a beer. "But you know what, Hank? You brought him to justice, and that counts for something." "Justice doesn't bring Laura back, or any of the others," Hank replied, running a hand over his face. "Doesn't make up for the fact that for months, we couldn't figure him out. We couldn't stop him until it was almost too late." Carl took a long swig of beer before speaking. "I get it. We could sit here all night and talk about what we could have done differently. You could replay every decision in your head over and over, but at the end of the day, Hank, we did stop him. And you know those families? They've got some kind of closure now. Might not be perfect, might not be enough, but it's something." Hank sighed, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I keep thinking about the town. How do you rebuild trust? How do you convince people this kind of thing won't happen again when they've seen it, lived it?" Carl set his beer down, his tone serious now. "We make sure it doesn't happen again, that's how. If there's one thing this case taught us, it's that we weren't ready for someone like Harker in a town like Pine Hollow. We were used to catching vandals and drunks, not predators. That has to change." And Carl was right. The case forever reshaped how the Pine Hollow Sheriff's Department operated. Hank made it his priority to tighten procedures, modernize their resources, and build stronger connections beyond their small-town limits. He coordinated with state and federal agencies to bring better tools and education to his department. The once community-focused force now had training in profiling criminal behavior, forensic advancements, and monitoring potential threats before they spiraled out of control. Pine Hollow would never again be caught unprepared. But for all the positive steps in the right direction, the weight of what had happened was harder to overwrite. The families of the victims bore the deepest scars. Laura Jensen's sister, Megan, couldn't return to college right away after the trial. The art scholarship she'd worked so hard for went untouched as she took time to heal in her parents' home. "I don't know who I am without her," Megan said softly to Hank one day when he stopped by with a casserole left at the station. "Laura and I were supposed to grow old together. She was going to see me graduate, watch my gallery shows." Her voice cracked and Hank let her cry without offering empty platitudes. The Fisher family sold their house after the trial and moved 2 towns over, unable to drive past the places that reminded them of Laura without feeling their hearts splintering anew. "It'll never feel right here," they had told Hank on their way out. "It'll never feel like home without her." For the rest of the community, fear gave way to paranoia before it finally waned into vigilance. Town hall meetings regularly focused on safety initiatives, and self-defense classes at the hastily upgraded recreation center gained traction for the first time in years. What had once been a sleepy, quiet town was now a town on guard, On the surface this might have sounded like progress, but for Hank, it was a bittersweet reminder that even catching a killer didn't erase the echoes of the pain they'd caused. One night, weeks after the trial, Hank found himself standing at the edge of the Yellowstone River where Laura Jensen's body had been found. The air was bitter cold, and the sound of rushing water filled the void of the night. He had returned here so many times since discovering her remains, but tonight felt different. It felt final. He crouched down, staring at the shimmering frost that blanketed the riverbank under the moonlight. "I'm sorry, Laura," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "We should have caught him sooner. You deserved so much better. I didn't know you, but I swear this. I'll carry you and every victim in my heart. And I'll make damn sure something like this never happens again." He stood up, his boots crunching against the ice. "Rest easy now," he whispered into the cold wind. The legacy of Jay Harker was not one of power, as the killer had intended. It was one of profound loss, pain, and sorrow. But it also became a legacy of vigilance, determination, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The people of Pine Hollow honored their lost neighbors not with forgotten memories but by carrying their lessons forward. For Hank, the case, and its scars, would follow him long after he hung up his badge. But he made peace with it as best as he could. He came to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting but remembering in a way that pushed people to be better, stronger, and more united. And though Pine Hollow would never be the same quiet town it once was, it was still home. It was still worth protecting from the darkness. Always. The verdict and fallout. The courtroom was packed to the brim as Rachel Moore stood before the judge, her wrists shackled in front of her, her face a pale mask of defeat. It had been months since her arrest, months of public speculation, investigative breakthroughs, and endless debates in living rooms, newsroom panels, and social media comment sections. The case of Rachel Moore versus the state of New York was no longer just about what happened in apartment 8B. It had become a national flashpoint. Was she a victim of abuse who snapped under unimaginable pressure? Or was she a cold-blooded murderer who hid behind her traumatic circumstances? The trial of the year. The trial itself was a spectacle, watched by millions on televisions across America. Rachel's defense team argued that this had never been a premeditated murder, but the act of a woman pushed to the brink. They painted a vivid, harrowing picture of her life with Jake Ford, his cruel manipulation, the relentless psychological abuse, the constant threats to take her daughter away. Expert witnesses took the stand, including therapists who had reviewed Rachel's years-long history of anxiety and trauma. They spoke of how sustained emotional dominance could fracture a person's psyche, reducing Rachel to little more than what one psychologist referred to as a caged animal, lashing out in desperation. But the prosecution was ruthless. Desperation, they said, didn't excuse her actions. Assistant District Attorney Monica Ruiz delivered blistering arguments, pairing sharp logic with icy detachment. "Rachel Moore didn't just kill Jake Ford," Monica declared in her closing arguments, pacing in front of the jury. "She butchered him. 16 stab wounds. 16. And let's not forget what happened afterward. The drum, the salt, the meticulous cover-up. This wasn't panic, it wasn't fear, it was deliberate, it was methodical, and it shows intent." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the courtroom. If we allow Rachel Moore to walk free because of her tragic history, what message are we sending? That murder is forgivable if we can just feel sympathetic enough? The jury shifted uncomfortably. Rachel sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Rachel's last words. Before sentencing, Rachel had the chance to address the court. She rose from her seat slowly, the chains around her wrists jangling faintly, and turned to face the room. She didn't try to defend herself anymore. There was no point. With measured breaths, she finally spoke, her voice softer than anyone expected. "I've spent the last few months thinking about that night. I've replayed it over and over until it felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. I keep asking myself, could I have stopped? Could I have done something differently?" She hesitated, her lips trembling, but no tears came. "The truth is, I don't know. I don't know if I had it in me to walk away anymore. Jake wasn't just a man to me, he was a storm I'd been trapped in for years. He drained me bit by bit until there was nothing left but fear and anger." She turned briefly toward the jury, her eyes locking with a few members for a tense moment. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, I don't deserve it. What I did? I'll live with it for the rest of my life, but I will say this. Jake Ford was never going to stop. He would have taken Emily, he would have destroyed her the way he destroyed me." Her voice finally cracked as she said, "And I couldn't let that happen." Then Rachel turned back to the judge, stared straight ahead, and fell silent. The sentence. The sentence came swiftly, and it was unforgiving. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The room buzzed with murmurs, a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. Some considered it harsh, others believed it was only fitting for a crime so brutal. The sight of Rachel being led out of the courtroom in cuffs became the final image that defined the trial. A mother, broken, resigned to her fate. "She got what she deserved," muttered one man from the gallery as the courtroom emptied. But not everyone agreed. Justice, many believed, had failed to account for the nuances of Rachel's story. Emily's fate. In the aftermath of Rachel's sentencing, the focus shifted to Emily, who had been placed in the custody of Child Protective Services shortly after her mother's arrest. The young girl, now 7 years old, was a silent, withdrawn figure in every photo released by the state. By all accounts, she hardly spoke in the weeks following her removal from the only home she had ever known. "She's a sweet child," said one of her foster care coordinators in a later interview. "But you can tell she's carrying something heavy. She has nightmares sometimes, wakes up crying for her mom." Efforts to find a permanent adoptive family for Emily began immediately, but her notoriety and the media circus surrounding the case created complications. Who would be willing to take in the daughter of a killer? In the meantime, Emily's stuffed bunny, a faded floppy-eared toy that had been clutched tightly in her mother's suitcase during their escape, became her constant companion. It was the only link she had to a past she was too young to fully comprehend. The debate that wouldn't die. Rachel's case divided the country. Activists for domestic violence survivors rallied around her, arguing that Rachel was more than a criminal. She was a victim who had been let down by society, by law enforcement, by everyone who had ignored the signs of abuse. "She shouldn't have been in that situation to begin with," said Karen Daniels, chair of the Domestic Violence Advocacy League, in an impassioned interview on national news. "We hear these stories all the time, women calling out for help, being ignored, and then they're forced to take matters into their own hands. Was Rachel more guilty of a crime? Absolutely. But where were the cops when Jake Ford was terrorizing her? Where were the courts when he used their child as leverage against her?" Opponents, however, were equally vocal. "Rachel Moore made a choice," ADA Monica Ruiz said during an interview following the trial. "She chose violence, and while I understand the sympathy, we cannot build a society that excuses murder based on subjective emotions or personal circumstances. No one has the right to decide who lives or dies." Reflections from Drake and Carter. Back at the precinct, Detective Michael Drake and Officer Melissa Carter found themselves grappling with the case's ripples even after the trial ended. "You think she deserved life?" Melissa asked one night as the two of them sat across from each other at their desks, finishing late paperwork. Drake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Deserved? I don't know. Maybe. What I do know is that 16 stab wounds aren't something you just wave away with a sad backstory. People don't get to play judge, jury, and executioner, not even Rachel Moore." "But it's not that black and white," Melissa pressed. "What about the system? The red flags we missed? She was stuck in a nightmare and we gave her no way out." "What was she supposed to do, Mike? Just wait until Jake made good on his threats, until he hurt Emily, or worse?" Drake shook his head. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "The system failed her. Hell, we failed her. But here's the thing. What happens when we start letting people decide, on their own, that murder's their only option? The second we cross that line, we lose the very system we're trying to fix." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the case still hanging over them like a shadow neither could escape. The legacy of Apartment 8. Years later, the events at Greenpoint Towers would still be whispered about. The stench that first alerted the neighbors, the steel drum, the desperate escape. Rachel Moore's story would live on as both a cautionary tale and a controversial debate. Could society have saved her before it was too late? Or was she always destined to become a headline, a victim turned perpetrator in a tragic cycle of violence? And as the years blurred the details of the case, only one thing remained clear. Emily, no matter who raised her or where she lived, would never escape the legacy of Apartment 8B.